Welcome back to the show. In recent news, New York State Governor Kathy Hochul and the New York State Department of Health issued an emergency regulation granting them the authority to create isolation and quarantine camps for any citizens with any infectious disease without proof of illness. However, a successful lawsuit filed by a New York attorney has halted the governor's measures. Here now to share more details is attorney Bobbie Anne Cox, and the one that is actually responsible for this. And Attorney Bobbie Anne, thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Daren. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And so walk us through this a little bit now. The governor has made her choice, and then obviously you decided to file legislation in opposition to that. Give us a little bit about what you thought was wrong with what the governor was proposing.
Yes, of course, definitely. So basically what this regulation said was that the Department of Health could pick and choose which New Yorkers they could force to isolate or quarantine. Now, that could have been in your home. They could have locked you down in your home, or that could have been that they removed you from your home and they put you into a facility of their choosing. So you would have no say in where you went. This regulation had no restrictions on the government. Okay, so what I mean by that is they got to decide how long you stayed in quarantine. You could not negotiate your way out of it. You couldn't say, look, I'll take a test. I'll prove to you I don't have this disease that you think I have. Nope, that was not possible under this regulation. There was no age restriction. So they could have come for you or your child or your grandchild or your elderly grandparent. Anybody was subject to this regulation. Because there was no time restriction, they could have literally kept you for days, weeks, months. I mean, it was absolutely no restriction at all. And they didn't have to prove you actually had a communicable disease. They just had to say, well, we think maybe you have, maybe you were exposed, maybe you weren't, who cares? We want to lock you up anyway. They could use law enforcement to help enforce their orders of isolation and quarantine. So you could have gotten a knock on the door from the sheriff or local police saying, I'm sorry, you need to come with us because the Department of Health thinks maybe you have a disease. I mean, it was just so incredibly illegal on multiple levels. It was completely unconstitutional. I knew that as soon as I read the regulation, I had to strike it down. So basically, I'm in this lawsuit, I'm representing a group of New York State legislators, Senator George Borrello, Assemblyman Chris Tague, Assemblyman Mike Lawler, together with a citizens group called Uniting New York State. And the whole premise of the lawsuit is separation of powers. The governor and her Department of Health are in the executive branch. They do not have the power to make this regulation. This is actually a law cloaked as a regulation, and only the legislature can make law. So that means our elected representatives in the New York State Senate and the New York State Assembly, they are our voice in government, and they are the ones who can make laws. That's what the Constitution says. And so when the governor and Department of Health did this, they have breached the Constitution. They have left their domain of executive branch of government, and they've crossed over into the legislative lawmaking branch of government. And you're not allowed to do that. When that happens, we see tyranny as a result, and it's the people that suffer when there's tyranny. You can't have the governor and unelected bureaucrats in an agency like the Department of Health making law. They can't make a regulation that overrides a law, which is what they did here, because we have law, Section 2120 of the Public Health Law. We've had it for 70 years. And that's how you want, if you want to have somebody who has a disease and they're not properly being safe in the way that they conduct themselves, then you can quarantine that person. But that law that we've had for 70 years has many due process protections built into it. And this regulation, no, it stripped out all the due process protections, and it just conflicts with the law, conflicts with the Constitution, and you can't do that. So thankfully, the judge ruled in our favor, and he agreed. This is not something the executive branch can do.
Right. Right now, as you have one, and if things have gone in your favor, we do understand it's not over yet. The governor's filed an appeal, and you're going to a appellate court. Talk to me about that and your thoughts there.
Right. So you're exactly right. The Attorney General, Letitia James, that's who represents the governor and the Department of Health. She has filed a notice of appeal, which means that they do intend to appeal this decision. It will go up to the appellate division in the 4th Department. And basically, now they're going to try to argue to get that court to overturn the ruling of the New York State Supreme Court Judge Ron Plotz, and they're going to try and get that overturned so that the governor and the Department of Health can get their power back that they gave themselves illegally to forcibly isolate and quarantine New Yorkers. So it's really important that we defend this appeal. In fact, Senator Borrello and Assemblyman Chris Teague, Assemblyman Mike Lawler, they're calling on New Yorkers to step up and speak up and to write and email and call the governor and the Attorney General, Letitia James, and tell them we don't want this appeal. This is ridiculous. You're going to waste taxpayer dollars fighting to try and get back a totally illegal and unconstitutional regulation that New Yorkers don't even want. And, I'd like to point out that both Governor Hochul and Letitia James are up for election in November. So, the mainstream media is not picking this up. They're keeping it very quiet because they know it's an election year here in New York. And I think if New Yorkers knew what the governor and Letitia James, our Attorney General, are doing, I think people would be pretty vocal when they go to the polls in November. And I think they would vote these two women out of office because this is just a complete violation, not just of separation of powers, but of basic human rights.
How do you feel these are, how would you determine these when you talk about ramifications? What would be the ramifications for the average person if this legislation was to pass?
Yeah, so if the appellate division overturns this decision and the governor and Letitia James get their way, then that's going to reinstate this regulation, which means that all of a sudden now the Department of Health will have the power to isolate or quarantine whoever they want. They don't have to prove you have a communicable disease. It does not have to be an emergency. This regulation says they can do this anytime they want. And it's just a power that is unbridled. There's no restraint in this. So you could imagine that opens the door to a lot of corruption. I mean, what if you have, I did a radio interview with Senator George Borrello not too long ago about this topic. And he pointed out, hey, let's say this regulation is reinstated on appeal. Let's say there's somebody that works in the Department of Health. They're not elected. Those are all just bureaucrats who are appointed. They're government employees. Let's say they don't like the boy that their teenage daughter is dating. What's to stop them from saying, oh, I think he's got tuberculosis, or, I think he's got COVID-19, and then all of a sudden there's an order for isolation and quarantine against, the teenage boy. I mean, the amount of possibilities of overstepping the power in this regulation is so broad and so shocking because there are no restraints. And that breaches the Constitution as well, because you have to have, the Constitution says you have to have what we call due process protections built into our laws and built into our regulations. And Judge Ron Plotz, who issued our decision in this case, he made it very clear. He said this regulation actually violates due process. He said there is no due process in this regulation. It simply gives lip service to due process. So it's very clear this is a highly dangerous, in my opinion, this is a highly dangerous regulation. So it's so important we win this appeal.
Yeah, as we get ready to wrap things up, I just want to ask you the question about the appellate process. How long do you think before you'll hear a decision in the appellate court?
So that's hard to say. The Attorney General, Letitia James, has filed the notice of appeal, so putting us on notice that she is appealing the decision. They have not filed the actual appeal papers yet, so I don't know the basis of their appeal, although I'm sure they're going to argue all the points. But it can take several months. There's not I don't have an exact time frame because I'm not sure exactly when they're going to file those papers, but it could take a few months. So we need to see what comes. And I really would love for your listeners and your viewers to really pay attention to what's going on and pay attention who you're going to vote for in November.
Yeah. Attorney Bobbie Anne Cox, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. We'll continue to follow the story, and we appreciate having you on with us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. If anybody wants further information, there is a website specifically set up for this lawsuit at unitingnys.com/lawsuit. People can get information there.
All right. And then also your website as well, coxlawyers.com. So thank you so much for being with us and sharing with us here on Open.
Thank you so much for having me, Daren.
All righty. And we want to let you know, don't go anywhere. We've got more Open coming up right after this.